Thank you for joining us. My name is Cindy Marques, co-founder and CEO of MakeCents. We are a financial planning company for Canadian millennials who are undertaking major moves in their life right now. And I am joined by Mallory from Viive Planning. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Cindy. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Mallory McGrath. I'm the founder and CEO of Viive Planning, and we work collaboratively with clients and their families to plan for the aging and end-of-life process.
Incredible. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. We're going to be talking about the importance of planning amongst the millennial demographic. Now, this is something that I've actually been talking about quite a bit lately, and I actually had the pleasure of diving into a whole body of research about the millennial demographic and really differentiating us from the cohorts that came before us and the one that is coming after us, and really dispelling the myth behind the reasons why we're in the situation we're in. It's not because of avocado toast. There are some real meaningful reasons why we're a little bit short to the buck and having such a hard time really catching up and achieving these major milestones that became part of this middle class ideal, the American dream, so to speak. It's just not feasible for us. And at this stage in our lives as millennials, many of us are in our 30s, we're starting families, we're facing a brand new mortgage, while still dealing with student debts, which is a mortgage of its own.
Yeah.
Many of us are running business. I really do feel like millennials are rich with the entrepreneurial spirits and everything that happened with COVID and the mass layoffs and the great resignation, as it's being coined as well. A lot of us are like, screw it, like I'm going to do something for myself. Yeah. So that takes a lot of support. I mean, you can't just run into these things and operate on a whim, which is kind of what I'm gathering from a lot of the individuals who end up approaching me to work together. A lot of them have just sort of been doing their very best, but bumping into walls, so to speak, trying to figure it out as they go. Has that been your experience?
Oh, definitely. And I think, you're obviously very focused on the financial side of planning, but over on my side, where I'm asking people to think about their mortality, right? Even if we're talking about their mortality when they're 90, and I'm talking to someone who's my age, 34, 35, well, for them to think about dying at such a young age, I wonder if it's just biologically like against how we're made, right? We don't want to think about dying. We think of dying as being an old age person type situation. And so there's a lot of denial around the need to plan to age, to plan to die, whether that be a premature death or that be a death when you're in your 90s, pushing 100. The choices that we make from a health perspective and a financial perspective in our 20s, 30s, 40s greatly impact what our aging process is going to be like in our 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And there is a bit of a denial around that, whether that be millennials specifically or whatever generation happens to be in their 20s and 30s. I'm not entirely sure, but right now the millennial generation seems to want to avoid talking about planning for the future, and probably because of what you said, where they're just up against so many roadblocks to actually achieve those stereotypical American dream middle class goals, right? And so how can they possibly think beyond that if they can't even attain the goals that are stereotypically done by someone of their age?
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's two things I really want to pick apart there. One being, the approach to planning and wrapping our heads around thinking about the future. And then also just the concept of death itself and dealing with that. So let's start with, the approach to planning. When clients are coming to me, usually it's sort of, they're exhausted because they've been doing their best to do it themselves. We're facing a bit of a lack of financial literacy simply because it wasn't taught to us when we grew up. It wasn't in the curriculum. Many of us, if you're in Canada especially, many of our parents, the boomer demographic, were immigrants. And I don't know about you, my parents were also immigrants, but it was a bit of a taboo to talk about money in the household. So if that's not where you were learning it and you weren't being taught it at school, then at what point do you have your first encounter with, learning about money management? And so they're coming to me exhausted because, okay, well, I tried my parents' guy, but he doesn't seem very approachable. I tried the bank, but they're trying to sell me stuff. No one's actually trying to give me advice or teach me concepts. And you know what? That's true, because the traditional model of the financial industry is incentivized by product sales. They're not incentivized
Right.
to actually teach you a thing or two. And so that's where I come in with a different approach that is very focused on the literacy, the one-on-one coaching, and helping you understand each step and why you need to undertake it and how to do so. And so I'm wondering, considering that you deal with end of life planning, how are you typically working with millennials? Is it to manage their own future, or are they coming to you with assistance for their parents or their grandparents?
I would say it's both. I would say that when a millennial comes to me because they're concerned about their boomer parents, the thing I always do is I use the example, I have a 5-year-old daughter, and I say, if I want my 5-year-old to eat broccoli, if I nag her to eat the broccoli, she's not going to eat the broccoli. She's not. Like, why have that battle, a couple nights a week and try to get her to eat that green vegetable? Instead, I put it on her plate and I eat mine and my husband eats his. And we say, eat your broccoli. And then that's usually the end of the conversation. If she doesn't eat it, she knows what the consequence is. She's not getting dessert. So there comes a point in our adult lives where it's not like we become the parents to our parents, but we take on a very different role. We start thinking about them and worrying about them in the way that we do our own children. And that's when we become a little sandwich generation. And so I say to millennials, if you want your parents to take their aging and end of life seriously, going to them and bringing it up 8 times out of 10 probably isn't going to go very well, because they don't want to be a burden to you. They don't want you to have to look after them. So it isn't that they don't care. It's so much caring. It's so much love that they want to avoid you having to do that. So I always say, let's forget about your parents. What are you doing? What do you want out of your life? How do you want to age? Do you like how your parents are aging, or would you like to learn from choices they've made, whether they're mistakes or not, and live a different elder life than they're living? And how would you like your end of life to be? Just because you're 30 and you've got 2 young kids doesn't mean you're not going to die next year. If you find out you have terminal brain cancer, what sort of life do you want for your family? What sort of death do you want for yourself? And if we can unpack that as a younger adult generation, if we can then show our parents' generation and grandparents' generation, this is what we're doing to prepare for our future. And, statistically, we're probably not going to need this information for a long time, but just in case, look at how well planned we are. Look at this peace of mind we've created for our young family if something were to happen. And then instead of going to the parents and saying, you should do this, and you should do that, and you should do this, you go and you sit down and go, oh, my wife and I, we actually started working with Mallory at Viive, and this is what we've been doing. It's been really informative for us. No mention to the parents that they should do it themselves. Just allow that reflection to happen very naturally, and then bring it up the next time you're there. Oh, we did this time with Mallory or whoever we're working with, right? And then eventually that starts to just turn the wheels in the parent's head, and then maybe you can approach them about themselves. But I think just going in, even with the best of intentions, with the best language and whatnot, it's still going to feel very out of the blue and almost like an attack. And so I think it's always best to have the millennials focus on themselves first and then move forward to the other generations.
That's a really good point, because again, I'm still finding a lot of parallels as to the reasons why, our demographic has a distaste in their mouth when working with, the traditional bank advisor, because it is very much, I'm in the suit, listen to what I'm saying. Here's the things that you should do. Don't question me, just do it. It's good for you. Trust me. Like, what? But I have other questions. I'm not worried about that. But typically when I'm working with them, I'm starting with the things that they're concerned about, whether that's debt and budgeting, but then I'm just talking about and hey, I also use these tools that I've created for you. And here's what I've done to plan through my retirements, or all of these things. I talk about the things that I've done and how I take it to the next level. And that tends to inspire them to be like, oh, you know what? That's true. That's a good point. I'd like that for myself too, as opposed to just shoving the importance of the long-term planning down their throats. You start the conversation with what feels very relevant to them, and show how, here's what I've done. And that usually gets the ball rolling and helps them see, no, you know what, you're right. And it makes them feel like they've led themselves to that conclusion that, things like insurance is important. Things like estate planning is important. And so that's what I want to touch on next as well. Is it's interesting, that you and I are having this conversation, because although we're, both in the finance world and risk planning world, typically when I'm talking to my clients about long-term planning, we're concerned about, financial freedom and financial independence. But to us, that means being able to retire comfortably and not necessarily having to work forever. But it's not just about retiring and being able to travel, because you're right, as we age, our health degrades, our ability to carry out daily activities becomes stunted. And so there's a lot more to this end of life and aging process than simply having a stack of cash to go, to be a snowbird and retire in Florida or travel the world, etc. So tell me a little bit more about some of the specific things that you're addressing when you're dealing with this aging planning process.
I mean, when I work with the majority of my couples are in the boomer generation that I tend to work with. I do have some millennials, I do have some from the silent generation and some Gen X, but it's usually the boomers that are coming in going, oh, I should really get going on this here. I'm now in my 60s. What am I doing? And so I try to get them to reflect on what their parents' aging process was like. It doesn't mean it's going to be carbon copy, but genetics. And so seeing that reflection is important. If there's family history of any degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, ALS, things like that. Obviously, that's something for us to consider as well. Family histories of cancer, things like that. But I ask people to imagine being 100. And it's funny, when you ask someone in their like the millennial generation, they're like, oh, that'd be so cool. But you ask a boomer to imagine being 100, and you almost see that little bit of exhaustion in them, like, oh man, that's like another 40 years. Oh man. And I think it's because they do have what we don't have, which is like an extra 30 years of life experience that we are lacking. We are new adults, really, we've accomplished things, but we're really still in that young phase of adulthood. And they've lived that big working part of their adult life. And there's a little part of them that's tired, that just wants to enjoy their lives. And so I get them to really think about like, what is it going to take financially, socially, from your family, to live another 40 years? Because you're going to be a burden. There's no way to avoid that word. And I try to get people to just embrace it. Your child was technically a burden on you when they were born. If we look at the definition of burden, you had to care for them because they were unable to care for themselves. And if you live to be 100, you will be a burden. But it's the level of burden. I should make some sort of imagery that I have for clients that shows the level of burden. And we want to be as low as possible, which is basically just that you're alive, but you have so many plans in place and enough money that there isn't stress. It's just basically an execution of duties, whether that be the duties that fall on your children, because that's been a collective family choice, not something that they're thrust upon them, but a choice that they will be a caregiver. Or there's enough money to hire people to be caregivers so that your children can still love you and visit you and be a support, but are not daily checking in, daily having to do things and basically avoiding their own life just so that they can care for you. So I really try to get people to focus on that idea of how long they could potentially live and really reflect on their family and their health. And it seems to go well. I was really skeptical in the beginning about getting people to really think about an aging process. I find that boomers are more open to talking about death, but aging seems to frighten them more. I think it's because they're the generation that has had parents live so much longer than any generation previously. And they've seen what a very long aging process can look like. And although it's wonderful, they're in their 60s and they have parents who are alive, which is great. It is an exhaustive process to care for someone in their late 80s, 90s, and more. And so I find that boomers are more open to talking about death because they know it's coming, but aging is scary for them because they're also healthier and fitter than any group of adults in their 60s have ever been. So it is a task, and it is difficult to get them to understand the importance of us diving into what the next even 10 years are going to look like for them. And money is definitely something that I point out. I explain to them how much a 24-hour PSW costs. That's a lot of money that most people do not have. And I actually read an article. Oh man, I should have written down. I read an article yesterday that said that 100% of people who were surveyed said that they didn't want to live in a long-term care facility. 100% of people said that. Yet the majority of them are going to long-term care and they're not aging in place. And that's a whole other, I mean, that's a whole other conversation we could have, the concept of aging in place and how we as a society will financially handle that as the boomers do get older. So it is difficult, but hopefully the more, younger generations come together and provide these resources and this education, we can help to make this a smoother process.
Yeah, and the boomers are facing very unique circumstances right now. Like you said, their parents are also still alive. If they weren't, heavily afflicted by the pandemic. Unfortunately, that was the case in a lot of situations. But otherwise, they're sandwiched between, now taking in their parents who perhaps can't afford long-term care facilities, because that is very expensive. It's expensive, if you think real estate is bad in Toronto, yeah, it's expensive to buy a house, but it's also expensive to die, just to put yourself in the ground. It's expensive to age, to have someone to take care of you. It's expensive, period.
No matter
what. Life, expensive.
Yeah.
Life is a financial parasite.
That's a quote right there. Life is a financial parasite. Wow. I mean, it's true. Everything costs money. I always say children are disgusting, money-sucking little beings, because they are. They're gross, and all they do is cost me money. It's all,
It's interesting for boomers because, yes, they are taking in their parents who are aging quite a bit. They can't afford long-term care, but they're also taking in their children, us millennials who lost our jobs and, are inundated with debt. We just graduated and we're starry-eyed entering the job market, realizing like there's nothing for us. Like, great, congratulations for getting that degree, but the 4 years you spent learning it, well, now it's replaced by an app. So sorry that your skills are now, integrated into a downloadable program. But anyway, that's besides the point. They're facing something very unique. And so, their retirement, their financial freedom is being dwindled by having to care for their parents and having to care for us as well. Those of us who have to turn to Bank of Mom and Dad to get a head start on our lives. So, I'm curious, how often do things like insurance come up in conversations with you and your clients?
So I would say that with millennials, again, they associate insurance with being old. I think that if you get millennials with kids, they're much more open to the conversation around life insurance. Something I've tried to really advocate for with multiple generations, but we'll use millennials as an example, is if they have children, is buying insurance on the children's lives as well, which is a big conversation. I remember when my financial advisor brought that up with me and I said, that's disgusting and morbid. Why would I buy life insurance on my child's life? Not understanding that it's actually a brilliant long-term investment for the child that I'm setting up, right? And so I think there's just a lack of education, right? Which is where someone like you and MakeCents comes in, right? Just having that education around for millennials to understand that there's a lot of ways to invest money to prepare for the future beyond just, maybe having an RSP and your RESP for your kid, and then that's it. There's a lot of very strategic ways to invest, to know that the money is protected from probate tax, things like that, right? There's a lot of ways to do that. And so, when I do speak with older generations, I emphasize to them as well, you could take out life insurance policies on your grandkids. What a great legacy gift to pass down. And so I try to emphasize that. People seem to be, more resistant, especially millennials, I find, to like a critical illness insurance or what's the one called? Dismemberment and I'm saying it wrong.
Accidental death.
Yes, accidental death and dismemberment insurance. Sorry. They seem to be like, no, it's fine. Like the likelihood of that happening. And I'm like, right, but you bought life insurance. The likelihood of you dying in the next 10 years, again, very low. But these are all important things to have. And I think the struggle is the cost involved. Like even for myself, my husband and I and our daughter, all three of us have life insurance and critical illness insurance policies. That it's an expense. It's definitely expense each month to have. And so I think it is about having the education to share with your clients, to showcase that this is very important and this is should be in your mandatory cost column in your budget, right? These are things that should be very mandatory to you to know that you have this security in place. And what's it like for you when you're talking with millennial clients about insurance? Do you find that they are open to it, or do you find that you're having to really make quite the sell?
Well, here's the thing. At this point, a lot of the time I'm working with clients and I'm starting with fundamentals like the cash flow planning and the budgeting. And then it just naturally ends up leading into the other things like,
Right.
okay, well, here's all the other risks, like the risk of not being able to retire comfortably, the risk of like, what if this and that happens? What will you do about it financially? Because, you know, we've stretched your budget just so you can set aside this travel fund, but we've made
Right.
no accounting for like, what if something major
Right.
happens? And so I feel like those of us in our 30s now are, the conversation's becoming easier because we are starting families, we are
Yeah.
carrying a lot of debts, and so we're becoming very worried about what we leave behind. But to touch on a point what you were saying, where it's like you're really trying to shove the concept down their throat, the way I like to look at it is, for anyone with a home or a car, I'm like, okay, well, you pay for home insurance and auto insurance, right? Like, yes, of course I have to. That's right, you have to. You don't have a choice. And so you buy it, and then you don't complain about it. You don't question it. And a lot of times it is very expensive, and you don't bring up things like, well, what if I don't make a claim? It's a waste of money, right? No one says that about home and auto. But again, you're not building up equity within these policies whatsoever. And if you don't make a claim, which is, again, it's a lottery, you don't want to have to win.
Right.
You don't make a claim, you don't get anything back, but no one's complaining about it. Yet we fight tooth and nail about protecting ourselves, our livelihood. And to be clear, like all the situations that we've presented so far, you know, the issues with aging, facing job loss or getting sick or passing away. There's insurance products for all of that. Disability insurance will help protect your income, especially if you're living on your own and you don't have anyone else, you don't have bank of mom and dad to turn to. What happens if you get sick or injured and can't work? You need to protect your income. What happens if your family needs to, you know, keep paying the bills and you're bringing in most of the money? How do you protect your income? Critical illness is another one. Like you said, it is quite expensive, but that's because the incidence of claim is so high. You know, there's the unfortunate statistics that 1 in 3 Canadians are going to get diagnosed with cancer at some point in their life. But the good thing is that it's no longer a death sentence, but it still presents financial consequences. Even if you live past it, there's some health concerns, there's a need to take time off work, the bills continue. So it is interesting when you know, you note the fact that people are more ready to approach life insurance, which is actually a very selfless product, because for the most part, if I'm buying life insurance, it's not for me, it's for everyone that's left behind. It's to protect them. But critical illness, disability insurance, those are living benefits. Those are things that actually protect me while I'm alive, but something happens and I need to face the financial consequences of it. And for the most part, our budgets and cash flow and assets are not prepared for us to self-insure through just, oh, I'll just handle the costs when they come. No, probably not. You'll probably obliterate all progress you've made financially, or not have that means and have to take on massive amounts of debt or other drastic measures. So it is very interesting talking about insurance and getting people to change their point of view on things, where they're finally like, you know what, that makes sense. What, you know, I'm not complaining about the home and auto, but this is me in my life and my finances stress me out all the time. So why wouldn't I care to protect that through a small cost? And at this age, millennials are in the sweet spot. At this point, we're still young enough that premiums are still quite attractive and quite cheap. And the payout you would get should you have to make a claim on this product is massive. So if you try to, you know, nitpick at the value of insurance and you really want to see, does it pay off? Am I getting, you know, my premiums worth? Yeah, absolutely. Especially for things like long-term care, etc. You know, that's actually a product that's been shelved. There's long-term care insurance that existed widely before that would, pay out a monthly benefit when you're incapable of carrying out daily activities. But that's been shelved because it was actually so valuable of a product that it became financially not worthwhile for insurance companies to offer it, because they were giving out so much more money than they would receive in premiums, which just goes to show that these are things that Canadians need, they do claim on, and it's worthwhile. And I had another point I wanted to bring up. What was it? Oh, you mentioned the aspect about buying insurance on your children, which is very interesting, and I am seeing that. But you know what? It's more than just like, okay, it's an investment in their future. It's going to help them out. At the end of the day, it's not like, I know initially you're like, oh, that's disgusting. Why would I do that? Why would I want to profit on my child's death? It's not about that. It's not even just about doing them the favor of letting them have insurance when they're older and not having to worry about it. It is also about protecting yourself as a young parent as well. Because if you think about it, if your child passes away, I can't even put words to it. You're devastated. You're mourning. You can't go back to work. You can't focus. No. So you are suffering an interruption or a loss of income because of this devastating occurrence. So it is very much still to protect you as a parent, especially as a new parent who hasn't had the opportunity to build up their assets, where if something happens, they need to take time off work for their mental reprieve to get themselves together. It helps you because you have suffered a devastating loss. Just as you buy insurance for yourself to help your spouse, you buy insurance on your child to help you, because if you lose your child, that's devastating. I can't even put words to it. I can't even empathize with it. It's tough, but that's why these products exist, to give you a bit of peace of mind. It doesn't eliminate how awful the circumstance is, but it helps you live your life and move forward.
Exactly. We also don't plan, we obviously don't plan for our children to predecease us, but also we don't have the money just laying around to pay for a funeral most times. And that's where that life insurance money can come in as well. Same with the critical illness insurance money for children, right? If my daughter were to get cancer, it's not like I'm handing her the $50,000 check. I'm using that to supplement my income so I can be off with her while she's in treatment and whatnot, right? And so, as you said, it really is protecting the family unit in a way, right? Making sure that you can put your sole focus where it needs to be, whether that be on helping a sick child or grieving, and not stress about the financial obligations you already have in place. And it's something I've only recently really learned about. It was just a couple of years ago that my financial advisor brought it to our attention, and I'd never heard of it. And at first, I even reacted the way I see clients reacting now. And I think it is the most, beyond thinking of our own demise as parents, thinking of our children's demise is I don't even know how to think about it. I don't know how to do it. And so, but, when it's put to you in the way that, you and I have discussed, it does make sense. If we have enough value on our own lives to take out these insurance, then why would we not have that same value on our children's lives and do the same thing? I think it's really important for millennials to see that, to understand that it is a needed expense. It's something that we should be incorporating into our budgeting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there is a lot of confusions and misconceptions about the process of planning and understanding the products and the services that are available to us and the things that we need to think about. But I think I want to save that for our next conversation and wrap this one up. I think this was really enlightening, sort of shedding that light on the millennial demographic and the boomer demographic and just the approach to planning and the need to plan. Any last minute words to sort of sum up your point here? Do you think we captured it all?
I think we did. The one thing I didn't get to say that I love saying is my favorite statistic of all time, which is that 100% of us are going to die. That statistic probably isn't going to change anytime soon. And so for me, even though it's a shock to the system, I like to lead with that when I'm speaking with clients, no matter their generation, because you can't argue with it. It's going to happen. And so we might as well make it as easy as possible process for the people that you're going to leave behind. And there are ways to do that. There are ways to make it easy so that they can do what they need to do, which is focus on grieving and not worry about anything else.
Yeah, that's a pretty irrefutable statistic. And unless you're a vampire, unfortunately, we couldn't get Count Chocula into the interview today. That's my bad.
All right, next time.
Thought my connections ran deep, but not deep enough. So I couldn't get him in. But other than, Count Chocula, we're all going to die at some point. So how do we deal with it? And on that very lovely, optimistic note, let's cap it up. And until next time, thank you so much, Mallory, for joining me here today. This is very, very insightful, and I'm looking forward to reconnecting with you.
Yes, thanks so much, Cindy.
Cheers.